justice for all.
Now today, we're glad to have an opportunity to hear Lester Paquin and Lucy Allen again. We had the pleasure of hearing them last year on the Andrea Doria, and this year we are going to hear about the Luisitania. I will let them do the program and won't spoil any information.
Don't tell people how it is.
No spoilers. But please give a warm welcome to Lucy and Lester.
You will note that we have titled this program Our Town and the Luisitania. The first time we offered this presentation was to the Barrie Historical Society, and the town we talked about was Barrie. To be sure, the story of the Luisitania is one of national importance, so its telling is significant no matter where its details are shared. In preparing for this evening's program, it occurred to us that even though the other segment of the presentation pertains to Barrie, the greater truth is that the young lady and her circumstances that we highlight could be from anywhere. So we decided to keep her in, to tell her story along with that of the Luisitania, as the two are now inseparable in the annals of history. The working conditions and cultural milieu we will reference, while particular to one community, could apply to any small industrial town, like Hudson, in the northeastern United States in the early days of the 20th century. And of course, the themes of love, tragedy, persistence in the face of adversity, and the devastation of war are universal, whether you live in Hudson, or Barrie, or anywhere else in this beautiful world. This year marks the 104th anniversary of the tragic loss of the RMS Luisitania, the Cunard steamship from Great Britain that was torpedoed and sunk off the southern coast of Ireland on May 7, 1915, while en route from New York City to Liverpool. Of the 1,918 passengers and crew aboard, 1,195 perished. Among the dead were 128 Americans. World War I in Europe had been raging for nearly a year when the Luisitania went under. Imperial Germany stood against the British Empire and France in a bitter and brutal struggle for European supremacy. The United States, which allied with England and France, remained neutral as the Luisitania sailed and would not enter the conflict for another 2 years following her loss. And amid all of this violence and uncertainty, one young lady from Barrie and those who loved her would be forever connected to one great ship and these epic events. Behold the 32,000-ton Royal Mail Steamer Luisitania, 787 feet long, 87 feet wide, 11 stories high. Built by the Cunard Steamship Company in 1907, the Luisitania and her sister ship, the RMS Mauretania, were the largest and fastest passenger liners of the time, records that would not be broken until the rival White Star Line built the Olympic and Titanic 4 years later. Even then, the Cunard sisters remained favorites for transatlantic travel, given their size, comfort, and attention to detail. Luisitania charmed everyone who stepped aboard. Cunard had gone to great lengths to make its passengers forget they were at sea. Glorifying European and particularly British design, the Luisitania, affectionately known to passengers and crew alike as Big Lucy, was adorned with the finest woods harvested from the oldest forests in England and France. Exquisitely wrought iron rails and bronze work were mixed with the finely carved oak and cedars to reproduce some of the most lavish decor styles, ranging from French Renaissance to English country. Lounges, smoking rooms, libraries, salons, private parlors, and a beautiful palm court all treated the traveler to a cross-section of European style, culture, and atmosphere. Lavish accoutrements were to be found throughout the ship. For example, all of the bathroom fixtures in first class were silver-plated. A typical crossing aboard the Luisitania, of which she had performed more than 200 Atlantic voyages prior to May 1st, 1915, required, simply for the entrees, 130 pigs, 40 oxen, 10 calves, 80 sheep, 60 lambs, 150 turkeys, 350 ducks, 90 geese, 200 pheasants, 400 pigeons, and another 4,000 other assorted birds and fowl. All met their demise to stock the Lusitania for just one ocean crossing. In addition, one trip from the United States to England required 6,000 tons of coal, 1,000 tons per day to power the ship. That translates into 22 coal trains of 30 cars each, emptying their cargo into Lucy's coal bunkers via barges built for the purpose. It was a dirty, time-consuming process, one that coated everything on deck and below decks with grimy coal dust that had to be wiped, washed, or hosed before passengers boarded. We will speak about that coal dust a little later. This photograph depicts the White Star Line's Olympic, the Titanic's sister ship, on its arrival in New York on its maiden voyage in 1911. Pictured on the left is the Lusitania, being pushed by tugboats out into the East River to embark on a voyage to England. This was the scene at the Cunard Pier in New York City when the Lusitania arrived on her maiden voyage in September 1907. The pennants flying from her superstructure indicate she had broken a speed record in crossing the Atlantic, a record the Lusitania would hold or break for many years, ensuring her popularity with passengers. During the construction of the Lusitania between 1904 and 1907, time was taken for some public relations photographs. Here, a fleet of motor cars passed through one of the ship's enormous funnels. This is a picture of one of the same cars shown next to one of the Lusitania's massive turbines. Here's another photograph to give you an idea of the sheer magnitude of the ship. Two of the Lusitania's 4 bronze propellers are seen, along with the crew applying a coat of paint to the hull. The propeller, shown nearest the photographer, was salvaged from the wreck of the ship and is now on exhibit at the shipyard in Liverpool where the Lusitania was built. One reality of the Lusitania's existence, shrouded from the public after her sinking in 1915, was the fact that her design had been modified at the outbreak of World War I to allow for her rapid conversion to military use, as a troop transport or munitions carrier, should the British government so order. In fact, when the large British superliners in service at the time, including Olympic, Titanic, Britannic, Mauretania, and Aquitania, were built, they were constructed with government funding provided in exchange for an agreement that these ships would be requisitioned, meaning they would be seized by the government if necessary. This indeed was the fate of all the ships I just named, except the Titanic and the Lusitania for obvious reasons. In this photograph, you can see evidence of the Lusitania's military preparedness in the form of the gun mount on the starboard side of the bow's boat deck. These mounts ran the length of the ship on both sides of the boat deck. Though these mounts were in place, no evidence exists that any of them were ever fitted with artillery. Power to move the large and magnificent ship came from a series of steam boilers located along the lowest levels of the ship. This view is of the boilers toward the stern. For those of you who paid close attention to our Titanic presentation, you will note many similarities of the two ships' designs. One obvious difference, however, can be best seen in the view of the Lusitania's stern. You will note the superstructure aft of the 4 funnels. These were the second-class public spaces. Cunard knew that, while first-class passengers and their money were most welcome and catered to, for practical purposes there were only so many wealthy people the ship could comfortably accommodate at any given time. There was only so much space available for multi-room suites and their amenities. Instead, Cunard realized their bread and butter came from catering to second-class passengers. far greater in number than their first-class counterparts, yet nearly as particular when it came to the luxuries they expected during their passage. So Cunard essentially redesigned its ships to meet this growing demand, allowing second class more space, more comfort, and thus more contentment. While older Cunard and White Star vessels divided their classes horizontally by deck, the more money you had, the higher your cabin was from the waterline, the Lusitania made this separation more vertical, with first class toward the bow, second class toward the stern. Third class and the crew still occupied the lowest decks on the vessel, however. The following photographs will give you an idea of the luxurious nature of travel at sea for those of means sailing in the early days of the 20th century. This is the portion of the Lusitania's palm court meant to evoke a Parisian bistro. To the right and out of the picture is a sliding glass wall which would open out to the promenade deck in good weather, giving the illusion of taking ease and refreshment at a sidewalk cafe in Paris. This is one view of the Lusitania's first-class lounge looking toward the bow. You will note the woodwork and the stained glass ceiling panels. This is an alcove of the first-class lounge along the starboard side of the ship. A view of the first-class lounge from the reading and writing room. Another view of the first-class lounge looking toward the stern. There's an interesting feature in all of these pictures of the Lusitania's public rooms. Note that every table and chair has an anchor pole holding each piece of furniture in place. While the arrangement of these rooms looks somewhat casual to the eye, none of these items can be moved. This was done as a result of the loss of the Titanic. When the ship began to go down by the bow, everything on board that could move forward did so, causing havoc and confusion for passengers caught in the path of flying furniture. After that, steamship companies learned their lesson and began bolting everything down. This also greatly aided during rough seas when one's wine table might be upset by a rolling wave. These are some color renditions of the first-class lounge. No ship worth its reputation would dare ask its wealthy clients to walk up and down the stairs unless it was their choice. This is the first-class elevator. This is perhaps the most beautiful room on the Lusitania. Back in the days when one had to write letters to communicate with absent friends and loved ones, and when a book in hand was a common occurrence, steamships like the Lusitania provided a room for you to indulge these civilized pursuits in graceful surroundings. This room also served as the ladies' counterpart to the gentlemen's smoking room. The purser was the ship's banker and chief financial officer, both for the ship and for its passengers. His office, shown here aboard the Lusitania, was where passengers would go to deposit money or convert it to foreign currency, to store their jewelry in the ship's safe, or secure important papers and valuables for the duration of an ocean voyage. Due to the Lusitania's rapid sinking and the death of its purser, James McCubbin, immediately following the torpedo strike, most passengers did not have the chance to retrieve their possessions prior to the loss of the ship. And as the disaster occurred shortly after lunch, ladies were not wearing their evening jewels. These objects remain entombed in the wreck, where someday technology may allow for their recovery. This is the grandest room aboard the Lusitania. The first-class dining room is 3 stories high, with seating on 2 levels and surmounted by a magnificent dome of glass, custom plasterwork, and recessed lighting. The room ran side to side on the ship and more than 100 feet end to end. It could serve the entire population of first class in one seating. Here is another view of the first-class dining room in the aft section of the room not covered by the dome. This gives you an idea of what the first-class dining room looked like in color. You can see the gilt gold leaf trim and the red velvet upholstery on the chairs, which you will notice are firmly attached to the floor. They swivel, but they don't otherwise move. This is the only hint that you're not dining at a grand hotel on the continent. While the reading and writing room tended to be the domain of the female passenger population, this first-class smoking room was exclusively for men, especially after dinner, when discussions about business and politics dominated. One can only imagine the topics the men discussed in this room during this particular voyage. These next two images give you an idea of the accommodations of first-class passengers during a typical Luisitania crossing. While not as opulent as the first-class counterpart, the second-class smoking lounge still reflects Cunard's desire to appeal to this growing passenger market. The color palette in this room included various shades of green. That's the right photograph. Unlike the smoking room in first class, this one ran the entire width of the ship. Perhaps more men smoked in second class. This gives you an idea of the size of the second-class smoking room. Note the vaulted ceiling. The colors in this room were various shades of blue. This architectural marvel, the second-class staircase, extended through all passenger decks of the ship. While it lacked the ornate dome of first class, the second-class dining room was no less impressive for its comfort and attention to detail. Perhaps not worthy of a grand hotel, the third-class dining room was nevertheless an efficient and pleasant place to dine and socialize, and perhaps more luxurious than the surroundings its passengers were used to. This notice appeared in every major American newspaper on April 22, 1915, 9 days before the Luisitania sailed. Here is the New York Times version, running not so coincidentally right beneath an ad for Cunard's Luisitania. It says that a state of war exists between England, Germany, and their allies. It identifies the war zone around the British Isles, and it warned that vessels, quote, are liable to destruction in these waters, end quote, passing through same at their own risk. Though clear in its intention, it was paid little heed by the public, especially those already planning to board the Luisitania. This was the scene dockside as the Luisitania began boarding passengers on Saturday, May 1st, 1915. This is the last photograph taken of the ship in port. Note the scale of the ship to the people. Some of these same passengers would see the ship again from this vantage point 6 days later in the Irish Sea, though both would be in great distress. This was by no means an exceptional occasion for the Luisitania. She had made 201 Atlantic crossings since her maiden voyage in 1907, and here she was, 8 years later, settled majestically into her role as Queen of the Seas. The sailing of the Luisitania on this particular occasion, however, was of heightened interest to the press of the day, given the German warning in the newspapers and the Lusitania's apparent defiance of it. The ship was a celebrity. Reporters swarmed the decks, interviewing passengers and crew, asking them how they felt about thumbing their noses at the threat of submarine attack. First-class passenger Alfred Gwyn Vanderbilt, no stranger to courting the press, smiled and confidently assured the reporters that the Luisitania can outrun any submarine. So there was no risk at all to sail aboard her. Standing next to Vanderbilt, Captain Turner concurred, stating the fact that the Lusitania's cruising speed was 3 times that of a submarine's top speed, and the ship's bow was sturdy enough to ram and sink any U-boat. Both men seemed to ignore one particular fact, the one that indeed doomed the Luisitania, that this assertion of speed only worked if a submarine was following the ship, or vice versa. It did not take into account what might happen if a submarine approached the liner from the side. One note lost to history. The Lusitania was some 4 hours late in leaving New York due to having to wait for passengers from another ship being transferred to the Lusitania. Had the ship sailed on time, she would have completely missed her rendezvous with a certain German submarine. This rendering by marine artist Ken Marshall shows the Lusitania as it is escorted from its berth out into the East River, from there turning to head eastward toward the open ocean. The ship is painted in its wartime livery. The funnels, normally a brilliant Cunard red, are coated in dull gray paint to lessen its detection at sea, though given the size of the ship it hardly seems to matter. Cunard had avoided covering the Lusitania in so-called camouflaging dazzle paint, which we'll show you later on the Mauretania, not wanting to alarm passengers and to assure them that despite the perils of war, life at sea aboard their favorite Cunarder remained calm and peaceful. The only nod to the Lusitania's pre-war exterior elegance was a band of gold paint applied at the base of the superstructure all around the ship, enlivening the atmosphere along the promenade deck. This is the Lusitania's master, Captain William Thomas Turner, at the helm of his ship on sailing day, May 1st, 1915. By this time in his career, Captain Turner was Cunard's, and likely all steamship companies' most senior and experienced skipper. He began his career in 1889 as captain of a square-rigged sailing ship on an African trade route. He rose steadily through the ranks of command, taking the helm of Cunard ships which grew in size commensurate with his expertise. At one time he commanded the Carpathia, which you'll remember rescued survivors of the Titanic disaster. He also skippered the Lusitania's sister ship, the Mauretania, and was in command of Cunard's flagship, the Aquitania, when he was called to return to the Lusitania's bridge 3 days before its final crossing. I say returned because Turner had captained the Lusitania once before, prior to his service aboard the Mauretania. Cunard admired Turner, now a Commodore, because he had set speed records for crossing the Atlantic on both the Lusitania and Mauretania, a tremendous marketing advantage. William Turner was a sailor of the old school in terms of discipline and protocol. He scoffed at any threat of submarines, seeing them as ineffective toys that would soon disappear because of their impracticality. He also showed great disdain for his passengers. He hated the social aspect of being a ship's captain, calling especially those in first class, quote, bloody monkeys who are constantly chattering about the weather or the sauce served at dinner. Despite this attitude, his passengers loved him, perhaps because of his remoteness and experience, to Cunard's great frustration, preferring to stay on the bridge or in his cabin. He left the social aspects of the ship's command to his officers and senior crew. Captain Turner's rigid principles also rubbed those in the British Admiralty the wrong way too. The Admiralty oversaw all of England's sea operations, military and civilian, and as such, all captains of civilian passenger liners were also under the Admiralty's purview. Turner had little use for these men, many having no sea experience or who held their positions for political reasons. One man who drew his ire was the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who saw Turner as arrogant and uncooperative. The feeling was mutual, and this toxic relationship would ultimately ruin Turner's career and perhaps seal the fate of the Lusitania, as we shall see. This is 25-year-old James Miller, an architect of Scottish descent whose claim to fame in our story lies in the fact that he designed all of the interiors aboard Lusitania and all Cunard vessels of the time. Like Thomas Andrews, his Titanic counterpart, Miller created and oversaw all aspects of every room and its decoration throughout the Lusitania's career, periodically revitalizing the ship's atmosphere to reflect the public's changing tastes in comfort and style. He was not a passenger on the final voyage. Charles Emilius Laureate, Jr. His name should be familiar to New Englanders as the son of the Boston bookseller Charles Laureate, whose emporium remained a source of fine books and manuscripts up until its closing in 1999. Perhaps some of you will recall visiting there. It was a wonderful place to browse and buy. Laureate was on his way to England that May at the behest of his father, and he carried with him several Renaissance-era manuscripts and rare books to show a wealthy London client. Laureate was standing on deck behind the bridge when the torpedo struck, and experienced a shower of debris when the torpedo exploded upward. He survived the sinking and wrote what is now regarded as the definitive survivor account of the disaster. Broadway producer and impresario Charles Frohman was, by all accounts, a beloved and respected man, kind, gentle, intelligent, and with an unfailing instinct on what stage entertainments would please the public. He was on his way to London to take in that city's spring crop of new plays, with an eye toward bringing the better ones back to Broadway. One of the many successes was the Broadway debut of Peter Pan. He's pictured here on the Luisitania's deck, accompanied by his wife, whom he referred to as his cane. Mr. Frohman did not survive the sinking. His body was recovered, however, and returned to New York. The last voyage of the Luisitania could perhaps more accurately be called the actor's special, as many theatrical types booked passage to the continent to take in the new season's offerings. Among them was this man, playwright Charles Klein, an associate of Charles Frohman's, who often tailored Frohman's discoveries to suit American audiences. He did not survive the sinking, and his body was never recovered. The Sage of East Aurora, Elbert Hubbard, was a bona fide, well-known, and well-respected American personality in 1915. He was a prolific author, humorist, and social commentator, and his purpose for traveling to Europe with his wife aboard the Luisitania was his desire to interview the Emperor of Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II. He didn't hold out much hope for that audience, however. "I don't think he'll see me," Hubbard said before departing New York, "because of that little essay I wrote titled 'This German Hell,' referring to the war. But I'm going to try. I think we can do business." Hubbard and his wife were last seen speaking with Charles Laureate as the torpedo struck. When Laureate went down below to retrieve his life vest and returned with vests for the Hubbards, they had disappeared. Neither was seen again, and their bodies were never recovered. He called himself the luckiest man on the Luisitania, and with good reason. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt I narrowly escaped disaster when, at the last minute, he canceled his passage aboard the Titanic 3 years previously. Enormously charming, he casually and with great humor discounted the threat of submarine attack to the reporters on sailing day in New York, putting them, his fellow passengers, and perhaps himself at greater ease. Vanderbilt was, above all, a horseman, and he was heading to England to oversee breeding operations at stables he owned there. The fact that his mistress was also in London also added to his desire to set sail. Vanderbilt rose to the occasion as the Luisitania sank, making sure many women and children had life vests. He himself refused one and could not swim. He did not survive the sinking, and his body was never recovered, though his family offered a $1,000 reward for the return of his remains. Theodota Pope, one of the best-known American women of her day, was this lady. She was, in equal measure, a noted architect, suffragist, human rights advocate, lecturer, and spiritualist. She was traveling to Europe to help organize societies for the advancement of spiritualistic pursuits and to set up aid groups, founded by wealthy Americans, among them the author Edith Wharton, to care for sick, injured, and homeless children afflicted by the war. Pope was philosophical about the sinking of the Luisitania, resigning herself to drowning as she stepped off the rising afterdeck and into the water. She survived, however, though she was rendered unconscious by a blow to the head from the oar of a lifeboat. She awoke many hours later on the deck of an Irish fishing boat, whose crew had pulled her from the water and stacked her body with the dead. Another theatrical personage in the retinue commanded by Charles Frohman was Rita Jolivet. She was a beautiful and talented stage actress whose career spanned Shakespeare and comedy. She survived the sinking and went on to star in many stage productions celebrating the Lusitania, in which she played herself, which raised thousands of dollars for war bonds. These are the stewards and cabin crew members of the Lusitania in a photo taken aboard the liner in 1914. This is but one portion of the 900-member staff needed to run the ship, from the bridge to the boiler rooms. The Lusitania was sailing at a tremendous disadvantage on her final crossing, as most of the able-bodied young men who sailed with her had been drafted into the military. This left a much smaller contingent of older men and foreign nationals to do the job, and their performance was less than spectacular, especially when the ship was sinking. As an example, the crew held lifeboat drills during the crossing, but only for themselves. Passengers were never assigned lifeboats, nor did they participate in the drills. Also, many crew members did not know how the life vests work, often advising panicking passengers to put them on backwards or upside down, resulting in many needless deaths in the water. The politics and world situation surrounding the Lusitania's sinking have become the stuff of legend. Germany was at war with England and France and vice versa. America was allied with England and France but was officially neutral. The Lusitania and her precious cargo was a large and tragic pawn played by all three sides. America and England dared Germany to act, given the innocent civilian cost of such action, though in fact the Lusitania was not so innocent, as in its cargo hold it transported war materiel, clearly a violation of the neutral rules of engagement. But the public didn't know this then, and for all appearances the Lusitania was indeed beyond reproach. For its part, Germany stated, and its published warning reiterated, that the Lusitania was indeed fair game, given its passage through the war zone, its ownership by a declared enemy, and its presumed military purpose. If civilians were endangered, that was the Allies' fault for allowing the ship to sail in the first place. Two of the key players in this cat-and-mouse game are pictured here, President Woodrow Wilson and his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan. At the time the Lusitania was torpedoed, Wilson was distracted on 2 counts. An American oil tanker named the Gulf Flight had been torpedoed but not sunk by a German submarine on May 1st, the day the Lusitania sailed, killing 3 American soldiers. The widower, Wilson, was also in the throes of passion, as he had proposed marriage to Edith Boulding Galt, who had rejected his proposal, and Wilson was fighting hard to get her to change her mind. She eventually did. For his part, Bryan, an avowed pacifist, was so fearful that Wilson would enter the war after the Lusitania was sunk that he resigned, though the United States did not join the conflict until 2 years later, when the Lusitania was becoming an afterthought. These are the 2 men who ran the British Navy and all civilian shipping. First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill on the left, and Admiral Jackie Fisher on the right. Both men knew the Lusitania was at risk. Both men knew the location of the submarine that destroyed her. Yet no warning was sent to Captain Turner. At the last minute, Churchill withdrew the destroyer escort Turner had counted on to safely guide him into Liverpool, allegedly because none were available, though 3 such ships sat at anchor within miles of the Lusitania's route. Again, with no notification to Turner. When the tragedy occurred, to avoid exposure of the Admiralty's shortcomings, both Churchill and Fisher blamed Captain Turner, alleging he ignored orders, which he never received, to alter his course and speed. The acrimony continued throughout the inquest following the sinking until the magistrate in charge, who also presided at the Titanic inquiry, who had little use for either Churchill or Fisher, pronounced Germany as being the solely to blame for the tragedy, exonerating Turner and infuriating Churchill. Churchill got the last laugh, however, as he made sure Turner never again commanded a liner of the Lusitania's stature. And now here's Lucy.
Well, what was the connection between landlocked Barre, Massachusetts, whose motto is tranquil and alert, and the huge ocean liner Lusitania? As Lester has mentioned, it was a young lady. Her name was Ida Exley, and she came with her family from England, from near Bradford, to settle in South Barre, where she worked at an English-owned mill. Her story is comparable to that of many immigrants who had one foot in the old world and another foot in the new world. She came to Barre to work, and her life was cut incredibly short. Francis Willey later became the first Baron Barnby, and he was the person who established and owned the mill in South Barre where the Exley family came to work. When Francis Willey's mill burned in Boston in 1902, he decided to rebuild in South Barre, an odd choice, a small town, fairly unknown to most people, and landlocked. So it was a very important investment for him to make. South Barre was not even South Barre at that time. It was a mill crossing called Crossleyville with essentially no population and just a mill power there, water power on the Ware River. This is a sign for Francis Willey's company in Bradford, England, and wool top is the wool fibers that are combed straight to one another in preparation for spinning into worsted wool. This map shows where Bradford is in England. It's in Yorkshire, northern England, to London. From the 19th to the mid-20th century, Bradford was the wool capital of the world. To find employees that were qualified to work in his new mill in South Barre, Massachusetts, Francis Willey turned to his headquarters in Bradford. He needed wool sorters with experience. That's a key occupation in the mill, and he couldn't just hire people in Barre to do that job. So here he came to find his workers. And this is the mill he built in Barre. Parts of it are still there. It has not been in operation since the late 1960s to early 1970s. The part on the right, the first floor part, was raised a long time ago. The higher part on the left is still there, but it's in ruins. You see a large smokestack on the right, and you can see horses carrying in wool. Well, it would be wool, it's been emptied, and a wagon. Now, this was after 1903, when the mill was created, and I have friends in Barre who still remember wool coming into the mill in horses and wagons. You can see from the cornerstone on that building, which is the opposite side now, that's now in ruins, that it was built in 1903. When Francis Willey built it in 1903, the cost to him in those dollars was $200,000, which would be, in today's terms, about $5.7 million. He also built a mill across the street in 1909. This insurance map shows the spread of buildings, a large spread, the original building on the right that we saw the picture of, and the other Nornay mill at the upper middle part. This photograph shows wool sorters at work in Lawrence, Massachusetts, because I could not find a photograph of them from Barre. And wool sorting, also called classifying, was the key to success in the woolen business. One animal, one sheep, could have 6 or 7 different kinds of fibers. They all had to be sorted out and classified, or the wool that you spun after all that combing and carding and scouring and washing and dyeing would not be good. So that is why Francis Wiley sought his wool sorters from the best place in the world for wool sorting, Bradford, England. Now, to find out how that mill changed Barrie between 1900 and when the Luisitania sank in 1915, I analyzed the U.S. Census for Barrie. And in 1910, the last census taken before the Luisitania, compared to 1900, it showed that Barrie's population grew by 43%, a huge amount. And that's more than 900 people. And this chart shows that a very large number, 472, were born in countries that were then part of the British Empire, which included all of Ireland at that time. Then we also have other countries below, including Italy, which is the second largest source of immigrants. So Barrie had a huge influx, not of just population, but of immigrants. And immigrants not only just came to live in Barrie, they traveled back and forth frequently. They often, husbands came and worked, went back and visited their families, brought them over at a later time, or just sent them money. But ocean crossings were frequent. Well, this is the little girl who sent men off to England to fight to avenge her death. She was a petite teenager named Ida Exley. She never reached her 20th birthday. It's not apparent from this poor quality photograph that was taken from a newspaper, but she was described as being 5 foot 1 inch in height, with a fresh complexion, fair hair, and gray eyes. Ida's father, Joseph Exley, was one of the wool sorters from Bradford who came to work in the South Barrie Mill that Francis Wiley built. Ida was born in late 1895 in Shipley, a village just outside of Bradford, in which the model mill town of Saltaire had been constructed. Well, it's no doubt that her petite size, her youth, and her vulnerability pulled at the heartstrings of the young men who met her. Her loss on the Luisitania caused at least 8 young men to leave South Barrie immediately to fight for England to avenge her death. She immigrated in 1909. This shows the ship manifest of the Ivernia with her mother and her brother. Her father had been here earlier. Calling her a spinster at 14 might seem a bit harsh, I know. Yeah. And we think of a spinster now as being an old lady who has never married. But it is also another way of saying spinner. And this means that Ida, at the age of 14, was already an accomplished spinner in the workforce, and she came to Barrie to be a spinner in the mill. And this slide shows the 1910 census of South Barrie, with a family living there in a place called Trafalgar Square, which still exists. Since this was an English mill town, it was named for, the various places were named for places in England. This postcard shows Trafalgar Square. It is the little cluster of duplex houses on the left side that you're looking at. On the right, you see the looming brick structure of Francis Wiley's mill, with the central tower and the large smokestack on the right. But let's look at some of the things that you might not think about. You see clear air with a sunset of rosy glow to the west, green grass with a horse grazing on it, and in that central courtyard on the left, chickens and rabbits in coops. This was very different from the lives that the immigrants left in Europe and England. And here we see a girl just about Ida's age working at a Bradford-type spinning machine. Girls like Ida were very much favored because they had good eyesight and very quick, agile fingers. And this is what Ida came to this country to do. Now think back on that postcard we just saw of Trafalgar Square with the sunset and the green grass and the horse and the chickens and the rabbits. This is Bradford. This is where the families that came to Barrie, the English families mostly, came from. This is Bradford's great smokestack, and there are thousands of smokestacks behind it. Bradford, of all the filthy cities of England, was the filthiest. And I'm saying that not out of... They were filthy because of the coal smoke that belched out of these smokestacks. The housing was centuries old. It was ancient, antiquated, unhealthy, crowded. The air was so dirty from the coal smoke that when snow fell, it turned gray before it reached the ground. And this is why families left England to come to an unknown place like Barrie with a strange name. This is another shot of Bradford with the smokestacks in the background and the crowded housing marching up and down the street. Sir Titus Salt. Well, he was one of the people who, like Francis Willey, tried to change things. He had been the mayor of Bradford. He tried to change the living conditions and failed. So he made his own town outside of Bradford. He named it after himself, Salt, and the river that flowed through it named Ayr, Salt Ayr. He created a village with clean houses, public washrooms, laundries, recreational facilities, medical facilities, and schools. It was just unheard of. A generation later, Francis Willey did the same thing in South Barrie. It was the company town. He owned everything. He built housing developments, the churches, stores, swimming areas, dance hall, you name it. Francis Willey owned it in Barrie, in South Barrie, and this was his model. As with Titus Salt, we don't know if Francis Willey was just doing this because it made good sense to have healthy, happy workers, or how much of it was charitable. This is a painting of Salt Ayr near Bradford that was done by a Bradford native, David Hockney. It looks fairly utopian. And it was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2000. And these are satellite images or photographs of what it really looks like today. And this is a row of housing where Ida's grandfather, Walter Exley, moved his family out of Bradford. And this is the street where Ida spent her first 14 years with her father, Joseph, and her mother, Hannah, and her two older brothers. Although this might look rather grim by our standards, it was considered much better than average by British standards. Yet her father decided it would be a good thing to move to South Barrie, Massachusetts. It's not surprising that the petite blonde Ida would attract a young man. He was Harry Taylor, also a native of Bradford and 13 years her senior. We don't have a photograph of him, but he was like Ida on the short side, being 5'5" with dark hair, eyes, and complexion. With his brother Arthur, he came to Barrie and was the head painter at the mill. They moved back and forth between England and America. He ended up in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, and shortly before the Luisitania disaster, his parents asked him to go back to Bradford to run their store so that they could retire, and he did that, but not before making an engagement to marry Ida Exley. They arranged her passage on the Luisitania, second class, and Harry actually obtained a special license for them to be married on Monday, May 10th, 3 days after the Luisitania was scheduled to dock. This special license meant they did not have to wait the 3 weeks that law required, and they did not have to be married in their home church. This photograph of the Luisitania leaving New York probably has Ida somewhere in there waving at her family and friends. She packed up her trousseau of linens and silver and her bridal gown and departed against her family's wishes. Like other passengers, Ida had read the warning from the German government and the threat of being torpedoed. Her family was concerned, but Ida said, well, if one end of the ship sinks, I will run up the other end. She was, after all, only 19, just a child herself. Her family believed that her second-class cabin was in direct line with the torpedo. We're not sure about that, but what we do know is that not one bit of her trousseau that she so carefully packed away was ever recovered, nor was any part of her body. There, I have found no memorial to Ida. There's no grave for her anywhere that I have found. She's not on the family's gravestone in Glen Valley Cemetery in Barrie. I could find no schedule for a memorial service for her at Christ Church in South Barrie. And because her body was never recovered, her name is not included on the big memorial in Queenstown, Ireland, where the bodies were taken. So Ida, at the age of 19, vanished from this earth. This is the landing stage in Liverpool, where the Luisitania almost always came in. It's where I believe that her fiancé, Harry Taylor, stood, waiting for her on that fateful Friday, May 7th. He had so much to tell her about the wedding plans, which would all come together in just 3 days' time. At some point that day, he was told the unbelievable, that the Luisitania had been sunk by a German submarine. Perhaps at first he held out some hope for Ida's rescue, but within 2 days, news by cable was received in Boston that Ida Exley was lost. She was to have been married the next day. I have not been able to confirm what happened to Harry Taylor after that terrible day, partly due to the large number of men named Harry Taylor born the same year in Bradford, of which I can count 12. Well, the young men of South Barrie and all over the British Empire were urged to avenge the Luisitania. And here we have a case of one young lady living in a small town, and there were a number of British nationals living in that town, and they took heed to this call. They had worked with her father as a wool sorter, and they probably drank beer with her brothers. This is a photograph of the South Barrie men that went off within a few days to fight for England. Within 30 minutes of the receipt of the newspaper that carried the news of Ida's death, which was probably a May 10th issue, 5 members of the wool sorting crew, all single, quit their jobs at the Barrie Wool to go fight in England. Also quitting their jobs to return to fight in England were the assistant to the butcher in Barrie Plains, an assistant painter at the Barrie Wool, and a teamster at the mill. You might be able to make out the little dog sitting in a lap. He belonged to another Englishman, John Saville, who was my neighbor when I was growing up. Not the dog. This is another photograph. It says of 7 young Englishmen who quit the mill to go home to fight, but there are 8 men in that photograph, and they're there with their Union Jack. They were setting out to fight the Hun. It stated in the newspaper article that one of these young men was Frederick Addy, which makes 9 who actually quit their jobs. Frederick was rather special in that he was the grandnephew of Francis Willey, who owned the mill. The company of 8, which did not include Frederick because he went to fight for Canada, left Boston on Saturday, May 15th. They decided to forego a large ocean liner since they had all experienced a cross-Atlantic crossing on that type of ship, and of course, they were thinking of the Lusitania's fate. Instead, they signed up as crew on a cattle carrier called the Canadian, a steamship that was carrying 1,000 horses to England. They were required to act as cowboys, helping to board the horses, much to the amusement of their friends from Barrie, who went to wish them farewell. This photograph shows a woman that is labeled as Mrs. Romani, bidding them goodbye, who would appear to be perhaps one of the Italian residents of South Barrie, but in fact she was Lagatha Caroline Romanus, a native of Scotland, who with her husband were proprietors of the Blythe Hotel that was owned, of course, by Francis Willey in South Barrie. Barrie has 2 World War I monuments, and it's rather incredible that the names of these men, plus several others who came of age later and went off to war, are on them since they did not fight for America. They went to fight 2 years before America got involved in World War I. You can see near the top Frederick Addy is the one who gave his life. He did not come home. Francis Willey's grandnephew. Private Frederick Addy fought for the 13th Battalion, Royal Highlanders of Canada. He was wounded and later died in April 1917 at Vimy Ridge. His injury occurred on April 9, 3 days after the United States finally entered the war. He is buried at the Barlin Community Cemetery in France. The only one we know that returned to fight to live and work on this side of the Atlantic was Charles Harrison Elliott. He had a 50-year career as a wool processor, and he actually worked in South Barrie a couple of months perhaps after he came back from the war, and then spent the rest of his career in Ontario. But he had a special relationship with Francis Willey. Charles's father was the manager of Sir Francis Willey's estate in Blythe, Nottinghamshire, England. His father and Francis Willey planned Charles's career from the time he was a small boy. In 1909, at the age of 15, Charles started his half-century stint in the woolen business as an apprentice wool sorter at the mill in South Barrie. His father and Francis Willey sent him there to learn the business, and although he had probably no choice in his career because of that, he managed to do well. Ida Exley is just one example of how each passenger on the Luisitania connected the ship to a family, a community, and a town, unless, as in my case, that town was Barrie.
This handsome young man became the devil incarnate to the Luisitania and all who sailed in her. Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger was in command of the U-20, the submarine which sank the Luisitania. Schweiger was beloved by his crew and by his superiors. He was known as being a fair and kind officer and a gentleman who rarely raised his voice and always defended and supported his crew. A product of the German aristocracy, Schweiger assumed his military service as a sense of duty. In the weeks prior to the Luisitania tragedy, the commander and his crew had sailed their submarines from the port of Emden in northern Germany, westward around the northern tip of the British Isles, then southward and eastward below Ireland and England itself. It was in the waters of the Irish Channel that he made history. The U-20 had 7 torpedoes aboard when it left port. Now, as it prepared to sail home, it had 1 left. The other 6 were expended on English and Irish fishing boats, and 2 of those weapons were duds. Schweiger was disheartened that his mission had been a failure, but could not believe his eyes when, in the afternoon of Friday, May 7th, 1915, he peered through his periscope and saw 1, then 2, then 3, then 4 funnels coming at him from the horizon. This was one of the largest ships in the world, either the Luisitania or the Mauretania, and she was coming right at him, flying the Union Jack and slowing down. Another note lost to history. Schweiger's U-20 was part of a submarine group under the command and acting under the orders of a young Imperial naval officer by the name of Georg von Trapp, whose name you may recognize as the patriarch of a certain Austrian singing family portrayed in The Sound of Music. So Kapitan von Trapp also bears responsibility for the sinking of the Lusitania. Now you're never going to hear the song Edelweiss the same ever again. This is the U-20, the German submarine that sank the Lusitania. Life aboard one of these new weapons was anything but glamorous. The vessel was 210 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 27 feet tall. This may seem like enough room for a crew of 36 men, plus on this mission 1 dog, a dachshund, and 5 puppies. But the crew only existed for 2 or 3 months at a time in one confining tube down the center of the ship. Most of the ship's interior was taken up by the sub's power plant, fuel, and weaponry. Water was rationed, fresh meat and vegetables were but a dream, and no one bathed, brushed their teeth, or changed clothing. If you wanted to shave, you did so using the remnants of your morning tea. Unless the sub could surface, there was no fresh air, only that which the power plant recirculated for days at a time. There was one lavatory, which could not be flushed unless conditions were right. Most of the men were wearing leather because it repelled water and smelled to high heaven. Everywhere there was the stench of diesel fuel. Everything you drank or ate reeked of it, as did the unwashed men themselves. Their body odor came a close second when it came to olfactory offense. One primary responsibility of a submarine commander was to keep order and some semblance of civility in such conditions. The 32-year-old Schweiger did so somehow. The U-20 met a somewhat embarrassing end when it ran aground off the Danish coast 2 years later. The crew escaped, but the sub remained as a tourist attraction. It's still there. Many wanting to have their picture taken with the conning tower of the submarine that sank the Lusitania. Walter Schweiger was given another command, but in 1918, that submarine and all aboard her disappeared without a trace, the presumed victims of British depth charges. These maps show how the Lusitania and the U-20 met their fate. This is a cross-section of the torpedo that struck the Lusitania. As the U-20's last torpedo made its successful approach to the Lusitania's 4-inch thick hull, it was observed by passengers and crew alike. Given their proximity to land, many thought the silver streak in the water was a playful porpoise. What passengers hardly noticed Thursday night was that the crew had quietly uncovered all the lifeboats and swung them into deployment positions. They had also covered the windows in all the public rooms, keeping any unnecessary light from escaping the ship. These were standard preparations as they entered the war zone. Friday morning, May 7th, had not gone well for Captain Turner. The day dawned misty with a thick bank of fog. Given his position off the coast of Ireland and his closeness to that coast, Turner slowed his ship until he could take bearings to determine his exact location, a process that took 4 hours. He was also fully expecting a promised destroyer escort, which never came. He was due to dock in Liverpool later that afternoon and was mindful of only one thing. If he arrived there too early, he would have to wait for high tide to allow him to dock, which meant he'd have to come to a halt and remain at sea, making him a prime target for submarines. He opted instead to slow his course, calculating his arrival in Liverpool with the tide. This change in speed, along with his decision to remain fairly close to the Irish coast, sealed the Lusitania's fate. He did not zigzag. He was never ordered to, and he did not set a mid-channel course. Again, he was never advised of any submarine activity so close to land, which would have put him some 70 miles to the south of where he was. Instead, he was well within sight of the Irish coast, passing the old head of Kinsale. He was so close to land, in fact, that school children gathered at Kinsale to watch the ship pass. What they saw, however, they would never forget. This is a picture of the Lusitania just before the torpedo struck. Sometimes that's a little louder, but anyway, you get the idea. The U-20's torpedo hits home just behind the bridge and just ahead of the forward funnel. Debris from the impact and resulting explosion blasts upward, showering those on deck in soot and wreckage. Captain Turner reacts quickly. He orders the helm hard to port and the engines full speed ahead, his intention being to beach the huge ship on the rocks of Queenstown Harbor, some 5 miles away. He knew that the strike of one torpedo was not fatal to the Lusitania. Her size, design, and series of watertight doors ensured that. He might even have made it all the way to Liverpool. Instead, he erred on the side of caution, wanting to make passenger rescue easier by being so close to land as possible, thus eliminating the need to lower the lifeboats. He would have been right on all counts, but he didn't take into account what happened next. This is what damage looks like as inflicted by a torpedo the size and power of the one that struck the Lusitania. This is in fact the Gulf flight, which I mentioned earlier. Its torpedo damage was repaired, though it was torpedoed again and sunk by a German U-boat during World War II. Although it would have been crippled, the Lusitania could have survived an attack like this. What it could not survive was the second explosion to thunder throughout its hull. Speculation at the time was that a second torpedo struck the ship. We know this to be impossible, as Schweiger had only one torpedo left when he launched it against his target, a fact he recorded in his log. Another theory, advanced in 1972, was that the contraband cargo in the ship's hull was detonated by the torpedo, causing extensive underwater damage. This has also been proven false, as the crates of unarmed shell casings were stored in the bow of the ship, far from the torpedo's path, and would not have exploded anyway. Rather, the cause of the explosion that sank the ship in an incredible 18 minutes was the ignition of coal dust. The remnants of the very fuel that powered the Grand Liner were the instrument of her destruction. As the torpedo struck and the second explosion rocked the ship, the mortally wounded Lusitania heeled immediately to starboard at a 45-degree angle, making footing aboard nearly impossible. This image, as a painting done in 1915, which is a remarkably accurate rendition of what actually happened. This version of the sinking shows the collapse of the third funnel, which did not happen, and a rather level sinking angle, also contrary to reality. Also from 1915, this drawing correctly positions the Lusitania in her death throes, but erroneously shows a flotilla of rescue boats hovering nearby. Fishing boats from Queenstown did not reach the disaster site until some 5 hours after the Lusitania was gone. This is another painting by Ken Marshall, which is perhaps the most accurate rendering of what happened. Note first and foremost how beautiful the day is. Sunshine and blue skies, and warm. It was a mild spring day. Note the disarray of lifeboats on the starboard side. On the port side, many boats could not be lowered due to the angle of the ship. Those that were literally shredded to pieces by the rivets in the ship's side. These protruded some 2 to 4 inches from the surface of the hull. It also didn't help that most of the Lusitania's portholes had been opened by the passengers to admit the warm spring air. This hastened the onrush of water, which brought the ship down more rapidly. Note Captain Turner on the port side wing bridge. He would remain here until the ship went down. Then he grabbed a deck chair, which he clung to until rescued several hours later. The end of the Lusitania was both brutal and heartbreaking. This was the view of the starboard side as the ship prepared for its final plunge. Unknown to Captain Turner, the ship's second explosion destroyed any communication between the bridge and the engine room. The last command the engineers had was full speed ahead, and that's what the ship struggled to do, accelerating her doom. The Lusitania traveled 2 miles from where she was torpedoed to the point of her final descent, her powerful engines and propellers thrusting her forward deeper and faster. The propellers were still spinning when they finally emerged into the afternoon sunshine. By then, the bow was on the bottom in 300 feet of water. Since the ship was more than twice that long, passengers were still clinging to the afterdeck as the bow slammed into the sand. By now, the sounds of the dying ship and its human cargo were deafening. The massive boilers have exploded, blowing the bottom out of the ship. This has the ironic effect of settling her more upright as she slips away. By now, passengers are stepping off the ship into the water, heading for any flotsam that will hold them. The Lusitania's last moments, just minutes removed from her final injury. Despite the savagery of her demise, she manages to slip beneath the waves in just 18 minutes with the grace and dignity which were her trademarks. Oliver Bernard was a survivor who later drew these depictions of the Lusitania's last moments. Canadian newlywed, Margaret Guire, managed to leave the ship but was then sucked into the forward funnel. When a boiler exploded, she was violently expelled, thrown some 100 feet into the air, landing in the water. Several hours later, she was rescued, unconscious, and taken to Queenstown aboard a fishing smack. Presumed dead, she was taken to the makeshift morgue. She awoke hours later, having to explain to her startled new husband why she was not a Negro nursemaid, as she had been labeled, because, according to Charles Laureate, the only white on her were her eyes and her teeth. This artist's rendition of Lusitania survivors in the sinking's aftermath gives some indication of the breadth of the tragedy. Of the 1,918 souls on board, 1,195 perished, 785 of them passengers. Of these, 128 were Americans. Of the 129 children aboard, 94 were lost. Many were infants. The lucky ones who survived the sinking were in the water for 5 or 6 hours before they were rescued, though many of these succumbed due to exposure. Many died due to their life vests being improperly worn. Another factor working against rescue was the fact that the water currents carried people in 2 directions, toward land and out to sea. One little-known factor that contributed to the deaths of several women was what they were wearing. Long wool skirts and their undergarments, when soaking wet, added more than 50 pounds to a woman's body. Many ladies were brought asunder by the weight of their clothing. There were many reports of several women stripping naked on deck before leaving the ship, and many survived because of this momentary embarrassment. Another woman, fortunate enough to have her life vest properly adjusted, was rescued from the sea unconscious because the glint of her diamond ring caught the eye of a fisherman in the fading afternoon sun. While dramatic, this photograph is likely a recreation of events produced to play on public sympathy in the days following the sinking. The bodies brought to shore in Queenstown were laid out in any public building that would accommodate them, waiting for anxious loved ones to come and identify the victims. Most never were. In all, 800 bodies were never recovered. The burial of the unidentified dead began in Queenstown the Sunday following the disaster. The lucky ones were provided with coffins until these were ran out. Most men were buried in shrouds. One wonders if Ida Exley is depicted here, or did she drift out to sea, or accompany the Lusitania to the bottom of the ocean? We will never know. It was never Captain Turner's intention to survive the loss of his ship. He honestly thought he was the last man off. Here he is shown on the streets of Queenstown, dazed and bewildered. Note that he is wearing a fisherman's cap. The morning after the sinking, Turner had gone into a local shop to purchase a hat. It was his custom while on duty to never appear in public without one, hence his nickname of Bowler Bill. As he was waiting to be served, a female survivor approached him and slapped him hard across the face. "My husband and my baby are dead because of you," she screamed, "and you have the nerve to be buying a hat. How dare you?" Turner fled the shop in tears. A fisherman who witnessed the incident gave the captain his cap, which Turner wore and treasured from then on. Captain Turner would also survive his scapegoating at the Lusitania's Inquisition, then go on to command other Cunard vessels, though none, thanks to Churchill, were so grand as he was accustomed to. 2 years later, in 1917, Turner was at the helm of the RMS Ivernia, which he had also commanded prior to 1910, when it too was struck by a German torpedo and sunk. Turner survived that disaster as well, though both he and Cunard came to a mutual agreement that he should retire. He did so, living out his days in seclusion in the English countryside with his mistress. His wife had divorced him several years earlier, taking their 2 sons to Australia, and passing away at the age of 77 in 1933. One of Turner's sons, Percy, followed in his father's seafaring footsteps, only to perish during World War II, when his British Navy ship was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat. This Lusitania life jacket has a remarkable story. It was found washed up on the shores of the Delaware River in Philadelphia, 4 years after the Lusitania sank. It likely floated on ocean currents from Europe down across the coast of Africa, there to catch an eventual westward current to America. The stories it must be able to tell. Walter Schweiger was never honored by his country for what he did, which was fine with him, because as time went by, he became more and more regretful of his actions. Instead, the German government minted and sold a medal commemorating the triumphant sinking of the enemy ship. This action so enraged British citizens that they copied the medal and sold it to the public as proof of how barbaric the Germans were. It worked. The money raised from the sale of the medal to British subjects was substantial, and I have one of these medals on the table over there for you to look at when the program is over. To say that the British were outraged by the sinking of the Lusitania would be an understatement. This picture depicts rioting against German-owned businesses in London. Hand in hand with the public's outrage was a sense of retribution and moral duty. This British recruitment poster touched on many emotions. The case of the Lusitania remained one of stark German aggression until 1972, when author Colin Simpson wrote this book, which he claimed literally blew the lid off the reasons why the Lusitania sank so rapidly, and of the secrets kept by the British Admiralty from Captain Turner and the public. His contention, supported by Lusitania manifests, was that the ship was indeed armed, laden with ammunition which justified its sinking by Germany as a military vessel. The Lusitania was nearly home. Thus, its coal bunkers, which ran the length of the ship on both sides, were nearly empty. The entire hold of the ship, however, was permeated with the dust left over from the fuel, which was just as combustible as the coal itself. When the torpedo exploded, it ignited this dust, which traveled like a fireball from bow to stern, blowing the bottom out of the ship, causing boilers to explode and taking everything and everyone in its path with it. One casualty of this cataclysm was that, by coincidence, a large company of the ship's officers, engineers, and senior crew members, more than 30 men, were on a freight elevator heading below decks to prepare the Lusitania's docking in Liverpool when the torpedo struck. The coal explosion killed them all instantly, resulting in an even more chaotic evacuation of the ship due to the loss of experienced personnel. The first divers approached the Lusitania in 1938. She lies in 300 feet of water, and at that time, if you were in a boat directly above her in the afternoon, you could see the sunlight shining off her hull. Over the years, her superstructure has become a deadly tangle of fishing nets. No serious attempt was made to explore the wreck until the early 1960s, when this drawing was made of what she looked like on the bottom, still remarkably intact after nearly 50 years. A major salvage operation was undertaken in the 1980s, but its timing was awful. The team brought up several objects from the ship with the intention of auctioning them off. There was little interest. The auction was canceled due to the fact that no one wanted to buy the objects, one of which is on display here on this table today. They were sold for a fraction of their value to collectors on the open market. The salvager went bankrupt on the whole operation. Then came Dr. Robert Ballard and his discovery of the Titanic. Suddenly, artifacts from these sunken historic vessels were more precious than gold. If only the Lusitania's salvagers had waited a few years to sell their bounty, they would have made millions. Timing is indeed everything. Once his exploration of the Titanic was concluded, Dr. Ballard shifted his focus to the Lusitania, which was a much easier dive. This image shows what the Lusitania looked like in 1993. Note the deterioration of the ship's condition since the 1960s drawing, as well as the complete disintegration of the ship's funnels, none of which came loose during the sinking, another Titanic lesson. Dr. Ballard estimates that the Lusitania will be virtually gone in another 30 years. During that time, the government of Ireland has placed a preservation order on the wreck, hoping to raise what it can of the Lusitania's remaining sunken treasure. They are motivated by reports that passenger Sir Hugh Lane was delivering several paintings to the Dublin National Gallery, among them works by Rubens, Titian, and others, and the divers in 1994 had spotted circular lead tubes on the bottom that perhaps held the treasures. Lane did not survive the sinking. Some say the paintings would have perished long ago, but others claim that if the seals on the containers held, they may be safe. Stay tuned. Mauritania. The Lusitania's sister ship survived to a ripe old age. She was requisitioned by the British government and used as a troop and munitions carrier during World War I, always escorted, by the way. The top photograph shows her during the war in her dazzle paint, which was thought to be an effective camouflage at sea. Had she survived, the Lusitania would have also been so painted. The lower photograph shows the Mauritania at the end of her days, waiting dockside to be scrapped in 1935, after a long, proud, and uneventful career. This is the last picture ever taken of the Lusitania, from a westbound liner as the Lusitania steamed eastward in May 1915. As we take one last look at the Lusitania as she arrives in New York Harbor, the question is asked, who is responsible for the loss of this great ship? The answer is everybody. The Germans, the British, the Americans, Cunard, Captain Turner. There is plenty of blame to go around, as it has for the last century, and likely will for another century to come. We also remember the loss of a lovely young woman from Barrie, If we are mindful, we can imagine that conversation and the reactions to it. More than a century has passed since the news of Ida Exley and the Luisitania echoed throughout central Massachusetts. It was an incredible story then, and it is an incredible story now. History is not always something that happens to someone else in faraway places. Sometimes it comes home to little towns like Barre and Hudson. Thank you very much for your kind attention. We do have some items of memorabilia on the table over there for you to look at, and if you have any questions, I will try to answer them. There are also some incredible refreshments on this table over here.
I'd like to thank them for this presentation, and we have a gift for the Barre Historical Society.
Oh, gifts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Excellent, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have no idea where Barre is. It's right in the middle.
Right in the middle, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
I knew about Barre from Mont.
Yeah.
So
Named after Barry.
I guess that's it, and you can have refreshments. So do I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Motion to adjourn the meeting. All those in favor? Aye.
Very good, Mr.
And very good, Lucy. I didn't screw up the dongle.
No, you did. It's so much easier than
It is so much easier.
your hand doesn't get tired. So I say, I found it
See,
easy.
my problem is I pay so much attention to what you're saying, I forget to look for the nod.
That's why it's almost easy to do it yourself once you get used to it. I brought the glasses I used in Peterson that worked. I couldn't see a thing up there. Apparently
Really?
it's the microphone, I think.
Oh, wow.
Let's get this undone so people.
I think it has to do with that